Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're tuning in today because we're going to dive into one of the most unbelievable, dramatic, and truly important stories in all of history. I'm talking about a time when the United States of America wasn't, well, very united at all. In fact, it completely split in two. We're going to journey back to the 1800s to unpack the American Civil War. This is a massive story of bravery, freedom, and an epic struggle that literally changed the world forever. So, let's get into it.
Think about the biggest argument you ever had with a friend or a sibling. You know, one of those fights where neither of you would back down for anything. Now, imagine that, but instead of two people, it's an entire country. Millions of people. Imagine a massive argument that gets so incredibly heated that it divides a whole nation right down the middle, drawing a giant line in the sand. Well, that is exactly what happened to the United States. And to really understand why, we have to look at how completely differently people were living back then.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Section 1, the North and the South. By the mid-19th century, the United States was basically functioning like two totally different planets that just happened to be sharing the same map. Up in the North, life was all about industry. People were building these massive factories, laying down railroad tracks everywhere, and running small farms. They were really looking forward to a fast-paced future built by machines. But down in the South, things were completely different. Their economy was built almost entirely around giant farms called plantations, mostly growing cotton. And here is the terrible tragedy of it all. The South relied on the cruel system of forced slave labor. They forced African Americans to do all the heavy, grueling work with absolutely no freedom or pay. So you have the machine-driven North starting to realize that slavery was completely wrong, while the wealthy plantation owners in the South fiercely wanted to keep it, simply because their entire way of life depended on it.
Now, this whole problem actually got way worse when the country started getting bigger. You see, in the 1850s, America was expanding its borders out west, scooping up massive amounts of new land. But instead of celebrating this growth, the North and the South started arguing fiercely. The big question was this: would these brand new lands be filled with factories and free workers, or will they be filled with plantations and slavery? Every single time a new piece of land was added, the tension just grew thicker and thicker. Honestly, the country was like a giant balloon that was just ready to pop.
Moving right along to Section 2, Lincoln and the Split.
Picture this. It's the year 1860, and a man named Abraham Lincoln runs for president. His political party strongly opposed slavery and wanted to stop it from spreading to all those new western lands we just talked about. Well, when Lincoln actually won the election, the South completely panicked. By early 1861, several southern states officially decided, nope, we don't want to be part of the United States anymore. And then, at exactly 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, Southern forces fired huge cannons at a northern military base called Fort Sumter. Boom! Just like that, the deadliest war in American history had officially begun.
This brings us to a super important vocabulary word: secession. Secession basically means when a part of a country decides to break away and form its own entirely new, separate government. So the absolutely crucial point here is that this is exactly what 7, and eventually 11, southern states actually did. They seceded. They broke off and even made up their own name, calling themselves the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy for short.
So, what do? That's the huge problem here. Honestly, if you were President Lincoln, how would you handle a split nation? Would you just let half your country walk away and start over? Well, Lincoln's answer was a firm, definitive no. He completely refused to accept the secession. In his mind, they weren't a brand new country. They were Americans throwing in a legal rebellion. And because he refused to just let the country break in two, it meant that a massive, tragic conflict was completely unavoidable. He had to use the army to try and put the puzzle pieces of the country back together.
Which leads us to Section 3, Battles and the Great Promise.
To really understand this war, we've got to look at the two main commanders calling the shots. First, you have General Ulysses S. Grant. He was a tough, deeply determined leader placed in charge of the Northern military, which was known as the Union Army. On the other side, you have General Robert E. Lee. He was a very clever tactician who led the Southern military, known as the Confederate Army. These two generals guided hundreds of thousands of soldiers through the most brutal, muddy, and just outright bloody battles this country had ever seen. The fighting was incredibly fierce, and for a long time, there was a real chance that the South might actually win their independence.
But then, right in the middle of all this chaos, President Lincoln does something absolutely incredible. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a special order put out on January 1, 1863, declaring that all enslaved people in the rebellious southern states shall be forever free. And this brilliantly illustrates how President Lincoln completely flipped the entire goal of the war. It was no longer just about gluing the North and South back together. It became this powerful, noble crusade to completely end the evil of slavery once and for all.
I literally cannot overstate how much of a game-changer this Emancipation Proclamation was. First off, it meant that newly freed African Americans could join the Union Army and bravely fight for their own freedom, and thousands of them actually did. Second, it gave the North a heroic new purpose to keep fighting. And third, because the war was now officially about ending slavery, countries over in Europe, who had already banned slavery themselves, flat out refused to step in and help the South. It was a massive, brilliant strategic victory for the North.
All right, on to the final chapter. Section 4, Peace and Ending Slavery.
So how did this massive conflict actually wrap up? Well, the final phase basically came down to a few key moves. Step 1, a Northern general named William T. Sherman marched deep into the South and captured the major city of Atlanta, cutting off a ton of important supplies. Step 2, up in Virginia, General Grant fiercely chased down General Robert E. Lee, finally surrounding his totally exhausted and starving army. Which leaves us with Step 3. General Lee realizes he's completely trapped, he's out of options, and he has no choice but to sign the surrender papers.
And that brings us to the exact date, April 9th, 1865. In a small, very quiet town in Virginia called Appomattox Courthouse, General Lee formally surrendered his army to General Grant. And just like that, the horrific fighting stopped. The bloodiest, most tragic war the United States had ever seen, a literal war of brother against brother, was finally over.
The real-world impact of these victories? Absolutely massive. First of all, the United States came back together. The secession was done, and the country was officially one whole piece again. Second, and definitely most importantly, the horrific institution of slavery was completely destroyed. Millions of people who had been unfairly treated as property were finally free. And third, shortly after the war ended, the rules were changed so that black men gained the right to vote. That marked the very first time in history they were officially recognized as citizens with a voice in their country.
But as we wrap up this explainer, I really want you to consider this quote. True equality would take another 100 years of fighting against unfair, racist laws. You see, the Civil War achieved something amazing by ending slavery and keeping the country whole. But getting rid of slavery, that was really just the first huge step. Even though they were technically free, African Americans still faced terrible, terrible prejudice. The journey to true fairness and equal rights had only just begun. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about the battles fought with cannons on a field, it's about the ongoing fight for justice in our everyday lives. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredibly important story today. Keep asking those big questions, keep exploring history, and I'll catch you next time.